Okay, so I'm super excited about this for a lot of reasons. For the topic, for the person, for all of us getting together before the holidays. Curt Witcher is the Director of Special Collections at the Allen County Public Library in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and he manages the widely acclaimed Genealogy Center, as well as the Lincoln Financial Foundation collection of Abraham Lincoln-related research materials. True to my heart as a true Illinoisan, Abraham Lincoln. Curt is in his 42nd year of service at the Allen County Public Library. And as we begin to say, as we are, he started when he was really young, because we can't believe that it's been 42 years. That's right. That's right. 42 years. Curt's service to genealogical societies from within those genealogical societies and for those societies include past president, former president of both the Federation of Genealogical Societies and the National Genealogical Society, and the founding president of the Indiana Genealogical Society. Curt writes, he's penned many hundreds of articles on topics of interest to family historians, librarians, and archivists, and has presented lectures at the state, local, state, and national level for a lot of years. When he started when he was 2, remember, to many genealogical groups across the country. He also serves on the Indiana State Historical Records Advisory Board and the board of the Friends of the Indiana State Archives. Throughout those years, when he started when he was but a babe, he has also received many distinguished honors. He has received in 1995 as a fellow of the Utah Genealogical Association. In 1997, from the Federation of Genealogical Societies, he received the Rabbi Malcolm H. Stern Humanitarian Award. He was also named the first fellow of the Indiana Genealogical Society in 2006. Moving on through the current century, in 2007, the National Genealogical Society awarded Curt the P. William Philby Award for outstanding lifetime contributions to genealogical librarianship. Other awards include being recognized by the Indiana's Lieutenant Governor with the Hoosier Hospitality Award, the Dallas Genealogical Society awarding Curt the Lloyd DeWitt Bachstruck Distinguished Service Award for that for outstanding contributions to the genealogical community. The Federation of Genealogical Societies awarded Curt the Loretto Dennis Zukes Award in 2018. And most recently, he received the Eli Lilly Lifetime Achievement Award from the Indiana Historical Society for his contributions to the field of history and the Indiana Historical Society. My contact with Curt goes back to the turn of the century. I was very fortunate to work with Curt for 6 years at the Allen County Public Library. I called him my colleague. I have created so many memories with Curt, and I am pleased today to create this memory with all of you and with Curt. I give you my friend, Curt Witcher. Thank you, Curt, very much.
Thanks so much, Sue. Gosh, to the attendees, it might sound like I'm dead, that you were reading my obituary. So we'll try to liven things up over the next couple of minutes. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon, or wherever it is in your corner of the world. Thank you very much, Sue, and your colleagues at Houston Public and at the Clayton. I want to go over just a few things, first of all, so that we can really enjoy our time together. My handouts, I tend to make them so that they're more evergreen than a walk through my presentation. So don't get consternated if the handout doesn't match what you're seeing on the slides, or if the handout is in a little bit different order than the slides. Again, my whole purpose in providing a handout is, yes, to context and give you important things about this presentation, but also for you to use it in the future. So that's item number 1. Item number 2, if you are a PowerPoint aficionado, fail me now and just sit back and enjoy the presentation. I overpopulate my slides with words, and that's just what I do. And I know I shouldn't do that, but I can't help myself. So again, thanks so much for everyone for being with us this afternoon. I'm going to see if I can turn my camera off, and I think I can. And let's begin. I enjoy talking about this topic because I think whether you have Native American First Nations ancestors that you've already identified, whether you believe you might, or whether you're just interested in knowing about this topic so that you're able to help others in researching their First Nations stories, whatever it is, I like this topic because it lets us exercise all of those great research skills that we should have and that we should continue to build, right? So Native American First Nations genealogical research is very different than what you might call standard, and I hesitate to use that word, but research that we're most used to, European American research. But the methodology, the strategies, the genealogical proof standard, the preponderance of evidence, the fan club, all that applies, perhaps even more with Native Americans First Nations research because it is so challenging. And we'll talk initially about why it is so challenging, just to paint the context, right? So to begin doing Native American research or First Nations research, I really strongly propose that you build a research framework. And it probably differs from what a lot of you may have done in the past or are currently doing with your own research. History plays such a crucial, absolutely crucial part in being successful with Native American research. Unlike what our expectations tend to be today, where I'll just go to a database and find everything, or I'll just go to this particular website and there'll be lists of names and relationships and records galore. And we don't find that so much with Native American research. It is so critical to understand the general history of these First Nations, these Native Americans. And I hate to use the term American Indians, but I used it here intentionally. Recall when we're painting a context for these people, these individuals, these families, tribes, and nations, how did they get the name Indian? They got the name Indian because some of the first encounters they had with European Americans, the European Americans thought they had landed in India. And voila, these must be Indians. Well, no. That misunderstanding, that misnomer has continued to play, has continued to apply for centuries. So that almost tees up why I think it's so important to build that framework. Do the history, as that last bullet point says, do the history. Native peoples are a very different society, culture, a very different people. And sometimes we tend to equate different with less than, or with somehow not quite as good as. But in our context as researchers, different is just different. And it's understanding those differences that can help us find records that aren't nearly as plentiful as they are for other peoples. The middle two bullet points, a very different society and holism as a Native American life culture. Now you might think Curt's getting into religions of the world here. No, I'm not, but it's important for us to understand that Native peoples tended and still tend not to so segregate their day or their lives. So this is my work life. This is my family life. This is my church life. I go to church every Saturday night, or every Saturday, or every Sunday morning, or every Wednesday evening. With Native peoples, it tends to be more woven into their life continually. Holism as a Native American life philosophy, important to understand, because where do we find the Native American church records? Where are those religious records? Well, most Native tribes, backing up a half a step, not until very recently had a written language. So you're not going to find records of anything anywhere because their tradition is an oral tradition. They tell stories and share stories, naming patterns, kinship terms, very different than what we're used to. So getting to know the area, the tribe, and the records that might exist is really critical. I've said to a number of people for a couple of years now, at least, we live in the best of times for doing family history and genealogy. So if we commit to, again, the last bullet point, do the history. If we commit to doing the history, we are going to benefit from finding intruders, individuals, entities that interacted with native tribes, and the records that may have been generated from those interactions. So I know I took a couple minutes setting this context, but I think it's critical for us to really do solid First Nations research. I'm going to walk us through a 3-step process. I'm firmly committed to this process. If you want to try to skip a step or combine two, that's fine. Whatever you feel works for you. With Native American research, I would just propose that it's pretty consequential to spend some time in each of these. So to have a shot at getting at records that may list some of our family's stories, some of our ancestors, I think it's really important to first thoroughly investigate the early area histories where you believe your ancestors lived, conducting, where you're going to conduct ancestral research to identify possible bands and tribes. So I think my family was in Pennsylvania and I believe they were Native American. Well, to even have a shot at being successful in finding those records, what tribes were in Pennsylvania at the particular time you believe you should be looking for your family's stories, for your ancestors. I hope I don't offend anyone, but I hope you smile quietly as I'm doing right now. Not everyone has a Cherokee Indian princess, and not every Native American is a Cherokee. For every person that walks into the Genealogy Center here in Fort Wayne, let's say 100 people a month ask a Native American related question. About 90 of that 100 ask about Cherokee. But yet their families lived in Michigan. Cherokees were never in Michigan. Their families lived in Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont. Cherokees were never in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. So you get the idea. I'm not going to belabor that, but first step in our 3-step process, thoroughly investigate the early histories where you are conducting ancestral research or where you believe you should be conducting ancestral research. Number 2, deploy strategies for locating the greatest number of documents and data for your potential tribe, the tribe that you believe your ancestor was a member of. And we'll talk about some of those. It involves being more thorough, perhaps being a little more organized, and perhaps being a little more comprehensive than we're used to in doing research. For some of our families, I have to admit, my family research isn't like this, but I know people, colleagues and others whose research is like this. They live in areas, never on the frontier, always firmly established communities, etc., that they can decide to miss a third of the records that are available, and they still get enough information to satisfy their need to know their ancestors. For Native American research, not so much. So develop some strategies for locating the greatest number of records to help document a particular tribe. And then the third point, work through that data to gain the fullest knowledge of the tribe and individual specific records. So if I can just encapsulate this one slide, go wide, meaning I believe my ancestors were, when I believe they were Native Americans in New England or Mid-Atlantic or Deep South or Tennessee, Kentucky, or Great Plains, Great Lakes. Then say, okay, I think they were in the Great Lakes. How can I find sources that will tell me about which tribes were where, how they interacted with each other. And then once I have a tribe or two identified as sort of my target for research, how do I do a deep dive on that tribe to find out where records might be? So know the geographic area to determine the tribe, gather data about the tribes to narrow the possibilities, and then study those tribes in your target area. I hope that makes sense. That really is, I think, the winning strategy. So our first step, let's just walk around a little bit through some records and through a little bit of narration here about how do we determine a tribe. I really, and as I said, it's the best of times for us, right? As family historians, as genealogists, with so much information being digitized between HathiTrust, Internet Archive, Family Search, we have tens of thousands of complete works, searchable, readable, downloadable online, right at our fingertips. We have no reason for not doing a search for all the general histories and geographic or location-based histories, both things that are just being published and things that were published in the 19th century. Look for it all to determine a good picture for what tribes are in the area you believe your ancestors also lived in. Critically evaluate oral traditions and family stories. I almost don't put this bullet point in some of my presentations because it's hard for me to perhaps clearly articulate what I mean by this. Sometimes in our family stories, we hear things that if we just took a half a step back, we would say, that's not really evidence. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Or why am I even saying this? Again, having worked in a very active genealogy center at a reference desk for decades, people come in with a photograph and say, I'm sure this person is my Native American ancestor. Look, her hair's braided. Okay, that's not evidence of Native American or anything else. Or they have high cheekbones, or they have a high forehead, or they have dark complexion. You might be smiling or rolling your eyes right now, but some people springboard from that into something they've heard in the family. Well, I heard they were Cherokee. I heard my family were Miami Indians. That's great to record. That's great to kind of put in our notepad, if you will, that we can go back and recall it again. But if you really believe that your family was Miami, it's good to know where the Miami existed, where they were removed to, what was their small t trail of tears during the removal process. It really helps to do the history. So again, determining tribal affiliation, critically evaluate family lore. One other strategy that I'm going to offer here, it's going to sound a little out of context, but when people are really exercised, like I need to get to my Native American ancestor, two things I tell them. Number one, and again, I hope you're smiling, most of our ancestors are dead and they're going to stay that way, right? So let's be methodological and use sound research to prove our way back to them. Because in that proof process, we may find that family story, nice family story, but no, not really true. The last bullet point, study maps and atlases, again, to try to see where Native peoples settled, hunted, lived during the time frame, the time periods that we're interested in researching. Hope that makes sense. We'll see in the Q&A. So I just have a couple screenshots I'm going to go through very quickly, but literally high percentage of county histories, town histories throughout the entire United States will have some section. Most times it's very general on the Native peoples that lived in that area or hailed from that area. Why not just quickly grab from as many county and town and regional histories as you can, the names of the tribes that are mentioned in those histories? Why not just grab that right off and say, okay, this is my big data set. And then as you begin to do more and more research, you'll narrow those tribes down to maybe a couple, three that, yeah, these are ones I really should explore more. So even though we know all of the downsides of secondary sources, we know all the downsides of those old, sometimes some people call them mug books, historical and geographical compilations that really had no proof, no citation, no footnotes. It's a beginning. It's something that will challenge us to explore things. Just more information we can glean from these county histories. And I'm just going to go through these slides fairly quickly. you'd be hard pressed to find a town or a county history where there isn't some treatment of native peoples. This is what the settlers ran into, land-wise, clearing the land. This is who the settlers ran into, people-wise. So really important. So when we're looking at these town and county and regional histories, what data do we seek? Buzzing down these bullet point lists really quickly. We're looking for specific geographic locations where Native peoples were. If it says in 2 or 3 county histories for Allen County, Northeast Indiana, that the Miami oftentimes hunted and camped at the confluence of the 3 rivers here in Fort Wayne, that's a clue. That's a piece of data that you can act on. That's where I want to focus some of my attention. The county histories may provide us with specific dates that place particular individuals in a location. And you think, why do we care, Curt? You just told us that there's not a strong written tradition amongst Native peoples. If we're going to try to find all the records of intruders, individuals that intruded upon Native lands and Native peoples, that interacted with Native lands and Native peoples, we're going to want to know who's in that area. So there were French forts in the Fort Wayne, Northeast Indiana area. Do that same thing for every single place that you're interested in researching. Third bullet point on the left, events that might evidence a document. Are there treaties? Are there anything? Missionaries saving souls, as they like to call it. And then moving over to the right, who are the intruders we seek? All of them. And sometimes we may have different definitions of intruders, but if you think of people that interacted with and intruded upon Native lands and interacted with Native peoples, settlers, soldiers, traders and trappers, government agents, missionaries, and all their records. Sometimes for particular time periods and specific tribes, all we have are the records of intruders. Atlas of Great Lakes Indian History, because I do a bit of research in the Great Lakes area, I'm going to use this, but I'm also going to use in just a second or two, a couple slides from a Cherokee book, since Cherokee is the most popularly researched Native tribe. But you can see how various geographic areas of particular tribes in the Great Lakes area. Here's just another map, colorized, if you will, with locations of Indian settlements. Here's yet a larger view, but more specific Indian settlements. Here's intrusions, if you will, upon Indian country in the late 18th century. These maps just can be so very, very useful. Here are a close-up of forts and native settlements in the Great Lakes area. These maps are golden for finding where Native peoples tended to settle and hunt and where intruders tended to interact or be to occasion an interaction with Native peoples. The amount of detail is pretty amazing. There are materials like this. I point this one out not just because I'm in the Great Lakes area, but because this really is one of the best map publications. But oh my goodness, it's not the only, not by far. It's not the only type of publication. How will you find these publications? By looking for them. Go to the Clayton, to Sue and her great colleagues. They'll help you use WorldCat and Archive Grid and Nutmuck and all these wonderful free tools. They'll get you started and you can go home and search the night away. Who needs sleep, right? We're genealogists, we don't need sleep, but there are amazing maps from the government printing office, from various state and local organizations, from various universities. There's just an amazing number of maps mapping Native peoples and their removal and movements. So this particular publication I just alluded to a moment ago, Race in the Cherokee Nation. And throughout this entire publication, while they're not focused on cartography or cartographic evidence of Cherokee, the book's filled with maps of where Cherokee were at particular times and where other Native nations, as you see here, the Creek, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw throughout Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. And just more examples of maps. and then the removal routes of southeastern Indians to Indian territory. That can help us a lot when we're trying to figure out what tribe should we be looking for? What records should we be researching? Just more examples of maps, and then where people settled, where Native people settled in Oklahoma. There's so much interest in First Nations history and on the genealogical side on finding our family's stories amongst this First Nation history. There are things being published all the time. This slide and the next slide will show you maps, really good, accurate maps that were published in an Indiana Historical Society publication, again, for the Great Lakes area, the location of treaties and land cessations, boundary changes. And then here are Indian towns near Moravian Mission and Counter Trail. And this was published in 2018, just a couple of years ago. So work continues to be done, identifying where Native peoples were. Take advantage of those maps to begin to context and hone your research. Moving on to lists and records of intruders. Look for all of these. Look for any possibility of European society interacting with First Nations and Native people, because there is where the potential exists for records. And yes, it's a heavy lift, and sometimes it's a long haul, but look for any records of explorers in an area. I know it sounds like a diversion to our normally rather focused genealogical pursuits, but if you are interested, if you believe you have family, direct line, collateral line, tangential line, that were Great Plains, maybe Western Native peoples, the journals of Lewis and Clark might provide a lot of great context. No names, no records, but a lot of context. Are there missionaries, Catholic, Moravian, Baptist missionaries that worked amongst the Native peoples? Traders, trappers, hunters, people who did commerce with the Native American peoples. It happened more than we know, and it's of great consequence if we're trying to, throw the net wide and find as many records as possible. Government agents, soldiers, early settlers. So all of these, we should look for any and every opportunity for someone to interact with, intrude upon Native people's society. There are actually publications, a lot of them coming out of researchers in Oklahoma, because a lot of tribes are living there now, lists of people, their nation, or their employment. Notice the first one there, trapper and Spanish agent. If this was the tribe in the area in the time period that I was researching, I'd want to know all about this John McDonald. Further down, William Thompson. Right beneath him, Thomas Tunbridge, trapper, who bears worst of character. Interesting comment, but you can kind of scan down that list of intruders. Find out who those people are. Do they have letters, journals, diaries, business ledgers, anything that would possibly give us more specificity about a tribe and the members of that tribe. So our research posture, focus heavily on who intruders are, get as much general information as possible, employ timelines, like who was in this place at this time, from as early as you can go to present day, maps, narratives. And those of you who know me, know I throw in that last bullet point. I am a citation analysis nut. I love bibliographies, footnotes, and endnotes, because they oftentimes tip us off, give us clues to sources. And in well-documented, some people like to call it academic research, in the bibliographies, we will find some OMG moments, some, oh my goodness, can you believe this? They will identify a college, a university, a historical society, a private institution's archive, and say, there's 33 archival boxes of Moravian interactions with this particular tribe in the mid 19th century. You'll want to get access to that and see what kind of information might be in there. So all of this, I know it's a little squishy. I know it's probably not what you were hoping to hear or wanting to hear or expecting to hear, but doing the history, do the messy non-name specific history. Again, as genealogists, it's not a bad thing, but sometimes we can be our own worst enemy by being so name focused. I'm looking for who are the parents of this person. Well, sometimes, particularly with Native American research, we need to find out what are the possibilities, because there's not going to be ready lists of records that we typically find. Hope that makes sense. So moving on to our second step in our three-step process. First step was to study an area to get a list of potential tribes. And as we begin to focus on where they lived and what they did and who interacted with them, we can take that list of potentials and get it down to, or try to get it down to, again, 2 to 3 or less, maybe 1 to 2 tribes. Once you really believe that you have reason, you have cause, you have built a case for it's a good possibility it's tribe X, then you want to engage or start to engage the second step, intensely study the tribe. And we do kind of the same things, right? We do an even closer look at identifying intruders and studying everything we can about them. And by studying, I really mean, see if you can take a look at every single page of a ledger, diary, letters, you name it. Deep, deep dive. Second, we want to know as much as we can about the tribe, because we're not going to find Brandon Witcher, son of Curt Witcher, son of Charles Witcher, son of Valentine Witcher, son of Frank Witcher, son of Michael Witcher. I've just run you up my paternal line from my third son up to my great grandfather. We're not going to find that. So we need to know how names are devised, passed along, and we're going to be frustrated a little bit by that, and kinship terms. You know, I'd have to sneak in that last bullet point on the left-hand side. Study the notes and bibliographies of all histories that you run into that you think are germane. Up on the right, pay particular attention to the narrator's, point of view. You will find terms in missionaries' accounts and trapper and trader accounts that are very inappropriate in 21st century America. We would indeed call them racist and biased terms. Don't let the context of the time period dissuade you from trying to wring out all the possible information you can. Yes, it's unfortunate, but it was of language of the time period. And then my last bullet point on the page on the bottom right, I inserted it here because we should begin at this point and continue out through all of our processes, remembering local, right? So Clayton is a wonderful library. Family Search, Family History Library in Salt Lake City, amazing. Dallas Public Library, oh my goodness, amazing again. Allen County and Fort Wayne, yeah, we can hold our own. Library of Congress, yeah, it's the nation's library. There's a lot of gold, figuratively speaking, in small local libraries. And that's why studying where the tribe was is so important, because you don't know what's going to be in a town historical society. In a little small public library, maybe a vertical file folder, a scrapbook. In a little historical society, there may be 2 or 3 linear feet of missionary letters and records and papers. You will never find those, at least not today, on Ancestry, on Family Search, at the Allen County Public Library, at the Library of Congress, and no offense to my good friend and colleague Sue, likely not at the Clayton Library either, because they're manuscript material, they're in local repositories. Can't say enough about that. So our tribal research checklist, if I can use that term, determine where the native tribe originally lived, migrated, and finally settled. I could say 21st century, but really there's not been a whole lot of movement in the last couple of generations. Locate firsthand narrative accounts. That's that intruder thing again. Part of the intruders are identifying all government agents that interacted with them and the records that they produced. We're going to kind of skip over that tribe-specific naming pattern and heredity titles, because we'll get to that in a moment. Find the Bureau of Indian Affairs office that serves that tribe and investigate the National Archives holdings. Bureau of Indian Affairs, a lot of people mistakenly think that's magic. I'm going to contact them. I'm going to give them the name of my ancestor, and they're going to plug that person into the right tribe. I'm being a little facetious on a Friday afternoon, but I've heard it a lot. Like, I'll just send them a name and they'll say yes or no. Well, unlikely. It takes some research. We'll talk about that in a little more detail in a moment. Just wanted to show you some more examples of published firsthand accounts, intruder records, Jesuit relations and allied documents, multi-volume set. It's on the internet for free, so you don't even have to go look at a library. You can explore this. If you're looking for long lists of names, you're going to be disappointed, because you're going to find lots and lots of narrative. I think it's 20 volumes of Jesuit relations amongst the native peoples. Notice where my mouse is moving. This year baptized as many as 1,200 savages. So there's one of those pejorative terms that needs just to be viewed in the context of when these missionaries were there. And wouldn't it be nice to have that list of 1,200 baptized individuals? Hardly ever do missionaries record that. But you have to look for the off chance that someone, a tribal leader, a chieftain, or someone else may be listed. Just more examples of how they're talking about priests, in this case, Jesuit priests, baptizing 52 persons at a particular place. Down here in the second orange square, 212 savages, among them being more than 70 children. A portion of them have gone to swell the number of the church triumphant. So, yeah, that's context, that's puff and bravado and a little bit flowery. But in there, we're getting the names of priests that we can take and research further to see if there are any more specific notes that didn't get in this particular published work. And you're saying, oh my gosh, Curt, this sounds like a heavy lift. It is. And we mentioned that a few minutes ago. The United States federal government, look for those government documents, federal government in particular, since they interacted with Native people so much. Online at the Library of Congress site, which is a challenge to use. And everyone pretty much recognizes that. The larger the library, the more challenging their electronic databases tend to be, and the more challenging their catalog tends to be. Carla Aiden is a wonderful librarian of Congress, but I think as a librarian, I can say this, library catalogs really stink. They're not intuitive. They don't look like Amazon or Google. They don't help you out. They don't remember your searches by and large. A few do, with some flaws. So you really have to take time to play, get to know the catalog. So as we've explored an area geographically in step 1, step 2, we've identified a tribe. Then's when we begin to look at indices and online guides to federal government documents. And there are numerous of them. So many so we could make you nauseous, literally, because there's so much to look through. But look for tribes and intruders in those government documents. I'm just pulling a screenshot from a page where my mouse is kind of moving across here. Number of survivors of Seminole, Black Hawk, Florida, and Mexican Wars. Information on Seminole Indians of South Florida. Consolidation of Indian tribes under territorial government in Oklahoma. Amazing amounts of information. I know when you first look at these, you think, oh my gosh, this is awesome, because there'll be all kinds of lists of names. Not so much. There will be some, but continue to look, continue to build your database of information. I did want to show you that there are some federal government documents that indeed do have lists of names. This particular government document is a report to the Secretary of the Interior. And seem to have frozen up here a little bit. I had to pause for a cough break. There we go. And you get a lot of information about one particular individual. So if you happen to prove relationship to this person that European Americans called Tiger Tail, you get some nice narrative. I like this particular document. It's a letter from the Secretary of War, who used to be in charge of Native peoples in earlier days. And February 27th, 1839, it's talking about all the Native peoples, I shouldn't say all, some Native peoples in Florida and all the African Americans that they owned as slaves. And there's a list. So here's the African American name, the age, the sex, and here's the Native person's, I'm pausing here intentionally, name, and some remarks. So you can see some of the African American families are grouped together, or my mouse is going on the right-hand side, grouped over to people on the left-hand side. And here are the Native names. I'm sure the Native people spelled their names that way, didn't they? Again, with a big grin on my face. No, those are phonetic representations of what certain individuals believed they heard. Native peoples may not even recognize that as their name. Just want to put that out there. Just more information, or examples, I should say, of treaties and things you will find in federal government documents. I know it's a heavy lift, but I call these things insomnia busters, right? So if you're having insomnia, continue to build your knowledge base with all of this free online material. Yes, it can be dry, it's history, but I highlighted this Article 6. The president shall appoint a board of visitors to consist of not less than 2, not more than 3. Boy, that's pretty precise. To be selected from such Christian denominations as he may designate, whose duty it shall be to attend all annuity payments of the said Chippewa Indians, to inspect their field and other improvements, and to report annually thereon, etc. Wouldn't you like to know who these board of visitors are and what records might exist from their workings with the Native peoples? I think that's a resounding yes. That's how we need to really dig into these contextual records. Wanted to show another list of names to make a point I just made a few seconds ago. These are phonetic spellings by the intruders, and this is their interpretation of what that Native name meant. The Native person may not ever have identified as fill in the blank. Again, down here, a list of interpreters and intruders, I should say. At the Library of Congress's website, I put in a box here. You can Google this, American State Papers, U.S. serial set. You will come to the Library of Congress's website. The American State Papers, the second set there, Indian Affairs. If you're researching early enough, you will want to look at this. All kinds of bills, etc. Republished, reprinted, I should say, in this Indian Affairs. Great for contexting information, great for finding out more information about a tribe. I hope you're with me. Hope this makes sense. We're going to take a little pause from building history to building knowledge, names and naming pattern. It's important to distinguish between Native names and English names. It's important to distinguish that when we see what looks like a Native name, as I've just said, that's a phonetic representation of what someone thought they heard that Native name being, and the meaning may not have been a direct correlation, a direct definition of that name. Those spellings are imposed, and so are the meanings imposed. Native peoples typically do not use given names or surnames. So my great-great-great-grandfather Witcher, actually spelled and pronounced Woocher at that time, but Witcher all the way down, generation after generation after generation. That does not happen with First Nations, with Native peoples. And if your eyes are getting big, or getting a quick Excedrin headache, yeah, that's a problem. That's a challenge. That's why history and context is so important. Third bullet point there, typically names do not preserve ancestral ties and family lines like European surnames. We just kind of touched on that. Names significant for a particular person in a specific time and place. That's how and why someone's named. And we'll take a look at that in just a moment. And someone can have their name changed because of something that happened in their life. A birth name can be different than a teenage year name, can be different than a young person's name, can be different than a midlife name, can be different than an elder person. Different names, all the same person. Names for Native peoples typically establish who you are by what you do or did, or by a significant happening associated with you or your life, not your ancestral ties. That's very different than our traditions as non-Native peoples. Just wanted to show you one example. I could show you many. So we have a person Mike swims under, also known as many stars. How you get many stars out of swims under or Mike or any combination thereof? Yep, that's a challenge, but that's a fact. How do we get that fact? Through looking through records and documents. Who's intruding, interacting with this person? What is he doing? How old he is? What's his family? What's his band, etc. Well, Mike swims under. His father's name is Swims Under. Oh, okay. Well, that makes sense. That's cool. That looks kind of like a conventional naming pattern that we're used to. But his father is also known as Chief Bird, also known as Last Tail Feather. Oh, no, none of that matches. And the mother of Mike Swims Under is Mink Woman. And again, this is a intruder interpretation of what her name meant or name is. If that sounds confusionist, it kind of is. So doing thorough research, keeping track of where a person is in a time, in a place, and as many records as possible. I want to throw up just some more examples. Touch the clouds, a tall person, young man afraid of his horses. In Lakota, it meant that this particular chief was so powerful and revered that his enemies of the Sioux, were afraid just to see his horse. Howling in the night, what a mother and a midwife heard when someone was born. Seen by the nation was a name, an interpretation of a name of the wife of Sitting Bull. Do you think she was born and named Seen by the Nation? No, not so much. Because at that time, she wasn't Sitting Bull's wife, and she wasn't seen by the nation. Again, just a final example of how one person can be identified several different ways. And to show you what I meant about phonetics, these are two treaties that were executed at the same time, right? It's probably a little challenging to see on your computer screens, but the blue arrows, so these are two treaties at the same time by the same parties involved. Notice the top blue arrow, this person and this person are the same. At the same time, they can't even spell phonetically the same way. This person, purple arrow top right, and this person, purple arrow bottom left, same person, not same spelling. I do that just to say, these are the challenges of First Nations research. So the challenge of kinship terms, I'm going to speed up just a little bit. I'm noticing my time. Do not follow civil or canon law kinship terms. Now let's quickly but methodically read through the second point. A mother and her sisters are equally described as mother to all their collective children. So the idea of brother, sister, and then first cousins, nephews, nieces, not a thing with the Iroquois nation. A mother and her sisters, they are sisters, and their children are siblings, and all of them are mother to all of their children. Wow, that's different, right? So when we hear kinship terms assigned to a particular individual, we need to be careful about what that means. Bureau of Indian Affairs, you must get familiar with how they operate Their website is worth exploring. It can be one of those things that you do in the middle of the night because you can't get to sleep or you've woken up. Records that the Bureau of Indian Affairs may include: enrollment records, allotment or land records, and probate records. Depends on the tribe. It's often better, as the last bullet point says, to query the Bureau of Indian Affairs office before querying any tribal office. Really an important point. Many researchers, when they believe they've identified the tribe, the next thing they want to do is query the tribal office, because assuredly they'll be able to tell me whether this person is on a roll, enumerated on any kind of list, and oftentimes they're very disappointed. Bureau of Indian Affairs has a genealogy section on their website. Look at it, read it, click on these links down here, explore those. Can help you out a lot. Tribal leaders directories, a lot of good material. National Archives, American Indian Records in the National Archives, a lot of good information is here. Use their catalog. Oh my gosh, it's hard to use. Do it anyway. Our catalog here at the Allen County Public Library is no walk in the park either, but it's our only access to these records. It's really, really important. Because this is Native American Heritage Month, the National Archives has a special page kind of linking to records. So they have a Native American Heritage Month link. They have an Indigenous Digital Archive Treaties portal. Oh my goodness, we can access so much of that right online on our own time. Scrolling down the page figuratively, other collections you can explore, other publications you can explore down here toward the bottom. Really, really quite consequential. Just clicking on one of those links takes us to screens and screens and screens of information. We're going to quickly move to studying all the records of the tribe. I'm going to go through these quickly because they're in your handout, right? So there are census records. Annual Indian census enumerations became a requirement in 1884, as that first bullet point says. They're kind of not exactly like census records that we're used to. Explore them anyway. Non-native spouses are often not listed, so they're really only interested in native peoples. Native families choosing not to live on the reservation were typically not listed in these censuses. And sometimes families chose not to be listed or tried not to be listed in these census records, even though they were a requirement, because it was so terrible to be a First Nations person. Just a quick pause here. Sue, you can jump in if I'm running disastrously too long, but the federal government for a good part of the 19th century, moving right up into the 20th century, the early 1900s, told Native peoples, assimilate, 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 assimilate times 10. You're not going to make it on your own. You need to assimilate. You need to become part of European white society. And then they did a flip in the early 20th century and said, okay, all you people living on the reservations, you need to come get enumerated. You need to come get listed, because these are the only people that we're going to pay out annuity payments to and other federal government payments. So there's still a lot of research, a lot of wrangling to be done through records to see, okay, this person was on the reservation because they were strongly encouraged not to be, but what is the ancestral relationship between someone on a census record and someone not? In bold, in red at the bottom, Ancestral Internet Archive, Bureau of Indian Affairs. Great place to look for Native people's census records. Being listed on an Indian census, though, does not indicate or prove that a person is of that tribe. There you go. Only individuals on enrollment lists. I underlined it in red because that's the record that pays. Finding enrollment lists for the tribe that you're interested in, that's the list that everyone looks at as far as these are members of the tribe. Sometimes censuses that have the English phonetic representation of a native name, as well as a regular European looking name, are called transitional records, or in this case, transitional census records. So I just wanted to show you a couple of quick shots of the Blackfeet Indian census roll. It's available on Internet Archive. Looks like our census records, right? This you can't see very well, but this you can see a little better, where there's some comments married to a Sioux. Here's the Samuel person. You can see family groups like you normally can on census records. This is a census record that lists Chief Sitting Bull. There's his English name. There's the phonetic representation of his native name there. And just more examples of Indian census records. If we use census or enumeration in the broadest sense of the term, this is a census of Indians from the Crazy Horse Surrender Ledger. So that's an enumeration of sorts as well. So we found this ledger, we being researchers found this years ago by carefully going through all the records of all that list of intruders that we just talked about. Annuity rolls, this is identified in your in any reading of Native peoples, list of tribal members entitled to receive payment for a specific time. You generally find these for those dates on your slide, 1848 to 1940. The period before 1885 is usually considered prime for lots of good data. Here's an example of annuity roll. Looks like a lot of handwritten documents we have to look through, correct? So you can read across the top. It's like a ledger book, left to right, name, age, sex, etc. And the other half of the book is over here. More just examples of published rolls where someone has transcribed it. Of course, as good researchers, we always try to get back to the original record because transcriptions are always flawed, always flawed. Enrollment records, as I mentioned, these are gold. These are the official census records. They're typically the records upon which tribal citizenship is based and payment and benefits are awarded. So if you can find that your descendant, you have a descendant, you have an ancestor on an enrollment record, if you can prove to that person, then you can rightfully say you are related to, or that particular tribe is a part of your ancestral story, your family story. Oftentimes people who are denied enrollment do go to court. You can find a lot of good information in court cases, particularly the district court in Washington, D.C. Believe it or not, the district court in Washington, D.C. at one time handled more than politically charged issues. I say with a smile on my face. So these bullet points here are the information you can find, you may find on enrollment records. Not all of them have all of this information, but most of them have most of this information. How's that for a little tongue twister on a Friday afternoon? So name of the tribe, date of validity, names, current birth, marriage, sex, date if applicable, degree of blood, names of both parents and their degree of blood. So really useful records. I know this is a horrible, horrible looking slide, but I wanted to show you on these enrollment records. And my mouse is kind of going up toward the top here. They're listing where this person was on various census records. They're listing other annuity payments, perhaps. So it's really documenting where there's evidence that supports this person being on this enrollment record. And you might ask, well, where do you find these? Well, yeah, it depends. So looking at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, exploring that, exploring what records Ancestry and Family Search may have found, exploring what the tribe may provide you with information about, typically not direct access to. Many people are so disappointed when they go to a tribal page and they don't find like nice lists, like you're going to an ancestry page. That doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. They're not on the web. You go through that. Allotment records, oftentimes called Airship Records. So it's all about the land. So when a lottee died, the ownership of the land passed on to all his heirs. All must be listed. And if the land has to be sold, all have to agree to it being sold. So you get lots of good lists of names when those events happen. And these are just examples of published allotment records. And will and probate records, same thing. We're going to blow through this side pretty quickly. Can't say enough about Indian school records. They tend to be fairly contemporary, but if we're trying to make a tie between our lines and a line that we don't, a tribe that we haven't researched very well, we don't have a lot of information on it. Indian school records can provide a bridge of sort. Again, they're pretty contemporary, but they can list all this information: name, tribal affiliation, degree of Indian blood. Right-hand side has more of the story of the individual. Left-hand side is more of the kinship or ancestry of the individual. Other Native American records to research, tribal records, oral tradition, newspapers. Oh my goodness, we could talk for an hour on newspapers. They chronicle the lives and times of individuals, so they're just amazing. Anytime you can get access to Native newspapers, even if they're very contemporary, like late 20th century, see if you can get access to them for free to see what kinds of historical snippets, what kind of history. There's so many clues. There's so many needles when we talk about needles in a haystack. Oh my gosh, I'm looking for a needle in a haystack. Well, get more needles to look for in newspapers, particularly First Nations newspapers. And this is just an example of one. I know it doesn't represent very well, but each one of these arrows pointing is a person being commented upon. Oh my goodness, how wonderful is that? And this is just the beginning of a digitized Indian school record from 1900, so a century and a quarter ago, and some really nice information in there. Training school manual, graduating classes. Take full advantage of internet resources. I have some at the last part of your handout. If you ever run into a dead link from a handout or anywhere else, just a small little piece of wisdom we can share this afternoon, just Google it and you'll get to the new URL. And I'm just going to go through these slides pretty quickly because there's the word, there's the phrase that pays. Google it. A lot of different tribal websites change, some frequently, some hardly ever. And again, don't expect it to be like an ancestry website where, yeah, here's all of our enrollment records. Here's all of our allotment records. Likely not going to happen. If we go to Ancestry and go to their card catalog, though, we'll find so many instances of First Nations, Native American material. I just keyword search Native American in their card catalog, and you just find so many different record groups. If you have access to Ancestry and you can identify a tribe of interest for you and your research, it's a great place to start. Family search is an excellent place to start. The periodical source index, published by the Allen County Public Library and available through Find My Past in many libraries, or email us directly and we'll send you a link to at least search Percy. Look for Native American material, tribe specific or location specific. And here's just one example of an article. On this one, they actually have the digitized image of the article available as well. Search Percy soon because it's going to morph real dramatically in the next basically 30 to 60 days. Just a cute little tip on this afternoon. I'm going to end here at the Genealogy Center's Gateway. All these are links to amazing resources that you have available for free. It's in your handout. Google, talk to Sue and her talented staff, but we have basically identified all the Native American material in our collection by tribe, if it is tribe specific. And then we have really a nice way of trying to organize what we have by tribe. So I'm going to stop my screen share here. You all have been very patient with me, and I'm going to turn my camera on and I'll be happy to answer any questions that may have popped up. And again, I know, Sue, I ran a bit long there.
It's okay. It's okay. Okay. A lot of stuff, a lot of great stuff. A lot of great stuff, Curt. And so thank you so much for doing this. Let's talk about now, I know, you got really excited during when you were talking about citation evaluation and things like that, and then in passing mentioning WorldCat. You want to talk about when you find a citation, what's one of the first things or one of the first places you go to try and see where it is or where you can find it?
That's a great question, Sue. And it is those really boring bibliographic database websites. There's nothing exciting about WorldCat or NutMuck or Archive Grid. But for us as researchers, it is really exciting because if it's a manuscript collection and say it's some small college in Tennessee, and they say in their archival collection, they have the papers of a particular missionary. It's like, okay, I will search that missionary's, the title they give me in Archive Grid in NutMuck, and even in WorldCat, even though WorldCat tends to be published materials, just to see if I can get more information. If I can get Sue a direct link from NutMuck into their website, into their Ask a Librarian or Ask an Archivist service, in a couple of minutes, I can be keying a question for the archivist about, hey, can you tell me a little bit more? Do you have a guide for this manuscript collection, etc.? In bibliographies too, you will find public, and I know you found this with your research, Sue, you'll find published material that's really well researched and well documented that no one knows about. Maybe a small university published it somewhere, and maybe 100 copies were printed. That's it.
Right.
And no one's ever known about it.
So that comes back to number one, not only searching citations, but then also searching keywords as you did when you did Percy and things like that. And then also coming back to the local library. I mean, we've been very blessed to have the collections that we have, but there's nothing like a local library.
Exactly.
So what I'm going to do now is I neglected to thank our team here of Mitch, Joy, and Justin, who of course without this wouldn't have happened, this and our entire series. So Justin with the Houston Public Library, Joy, and Mitch on our side at Clayton. And let's bring on Mitch now, who has some questions, I'm sure, from the chat, Curt, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay, Curt, thank you. That was amazing. So much information to go through. We got an early question from Mary Hoyer. Mary says, from Chicago, has an ancestor claiming Mississippi Choctaw, born in North Carolina. The ancestor stayed behind during the Trail of Tears in Mississippi. Where are the Indian agent records that they might have registered with? Agent records that they might have registered with.
Right. So great question, and not a fossil one to answer. So if they did stay behind, really focusing on the place where they decided to settle, where they decided to assimilate, if you will. So I would certainly focus on that particular geographic place and see what town records are available that might evidence who the agent was, how they interacted. If they left the trail, if we look at this real carefully, they may not have wanted to do much interacting because they wanted not to be known as not going along with the removal. So we may not find a really good list. So the tribe already. So I would take as deep a dive as I could into the history of that particular tribe and how they talk about, how they memorialize, how they remember those people who did not settle in Oklahoma, did not make it to the reservation, did not make it to the place where they were designated to live. That's just really, really crucial. You have an advantage because you've identified and you're fairly confident about the tribe. So do a deep dive. There may not be any agent records, like these are the people that did not go on the trip, did not migrate with the rest of the tribe. So do a really deep dive. You're from the Chicago area. I believe, check their website though. I believe they're open for appointments, but they may not yet be. But the day is the Newberry Library in Chicago. Oh my goodness. They have an amazing Native American collection. It's one of the best ones in the world. And certainly it covers North America well. The Darcy Mcnichol Native American collection of the Newberry Library. Google Newberry Library. And they have great reference librarians, great reference professionals there. It is a private library, but the public is welcome there, and they have a pretty great website. So if you're in Chicago, you really can't afford to miss tapping their expertise and their collection.
Mitch, you're muted.
There we go. Okay. From Grant G. Grant says the grandmother born in 1908 in Oklahoma. According to her delayed birth certificate, she was shown as white, not Indian or other term for Native American. Is that the norm, or are most Native Americans shown as Native American?
Great question, Grant. In the early part of the 20th century in Oklahoma, most Native Americans were identified as such. It was to their advantage to be identified as such, and it was for them an appropriate point of identity, of pride, if you will. So there wasn't a whole lot of passing as white going on in Oklahoma at the turn of 1800s into the 1900s. So if it said white, I mean, there's always the possibility that any piece of data is incorrect, but if it said white, it likely was a non-native.
Okay. From Mary Hoyer, as asking about your sources, Mary wants to know if we can get a list of titles in the slides that are not in the handout.
There aren't many of them. Asking a question is probably hard to get an answer to. Is there a particular 1, 2, 3 titles that Mary was most interested in? I mean, I'd be happy to share my information. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. If she's referring to like Nutmuck, National Union Catalog of Manuscript Collections, or WorldCat, I'd be happy to throw that list together and send it to Sue or anyone on your team, or you could email us here at the library.
Okay, and Mary just entered titles of manuscripts and books.
Oh. I will say, Curt, I will say that we're recording the presentation. So,
Sure.
We could, you could go back and watch it. It takes Mitch maybe a couple weeks or so, and then you could stop it maybe a month sometimes to get it up, but you could stop it that way also. So, but, and you could call us, if you don't know, you can either call the Allen County Public Library.
Or, yep.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Natalie just gives us some information. She says that the Indian Census Rolls, 1885 to 1940, are on fold 3 in their Native American collection.
Yes. Fold 3 being an ancestry property, absolutely. And I'm not advising you do this, but they're also all of that Native American 640 rolls of Native American Census records, American Indian Census records, are also for free on Internet Archive. Why are they for free? Because there's no index to them. So it can be brutal to try to look through them, but you can use National Archive finding aids to see which roll or rolls you might need to click through, but it is a click through process. But fold 3, Ancestry, yes, they have amazing collections. And again, go to Ancestry, look in their catalog, go to fold 3, absolutely. Really great collections.
And fold 3 is a pay account, but it is available for free to people with Houston Library Card online. Yeah. So Michelle Kelly asks, is there a good resource for researching Pueblos in New Mexico?
Great question. I personally haven't done any Pueblo research, but so strategy I would take is, number one, if you know a particular area, I would begin, because it takes a while and it's very interesting. I begin to do that search of the geographic area where the Pueblo tribe lived and inhabited. A lifetime ago, I actually taught for an academic semester at St. Catherine's Indian School in Santa Fe. And amongst our students were Pueblo, Zuni, and Santa Clara that came to that particular school. Secondly, go to the National Archives and see what's available for Pueblos. Look deeply through the National Archives holding. The Dallas, well, actually it's not Dallas, it's Fort Worth. I usually say the Dallas Fort Worth, but the Fort Worth branch of the National Archives has the largest collection of Native American American Indian records of any branch of the National Archives. They used to have a really nice website that helped you discover and explore that better. A number of years ago, the National Archives went to one unified design, so a lot of the branches lost their independence. Meg Hacker, I believe, is still the director of the Fort Worth branch of the National Archives. Before her was Kent Carter. Kent Carter wrote the definitive work on the 5 civilized tribes, but Meg and her staff, the staff at the Fort Worth branch of the National Archives, would help you ascertain what Pueblo information, what Pueblo roles, census, enrollment, allotment they would have. And they're also very good at pointing you to other resources. So I'd certainly use that National Archives website, but specifically see if you can't get in contact with Fort Worth branch, with their staff because of their expertise in that area. And then look for Pueblo Indians in WorldCat, in National Union Catalog of Manuscript Collections, and anything that would, search for the known field world of data. Again, like our previous questioner, you're fortunate in that you do sound like you have reason to believe, a firm belief that it is that tribe, so you can really focus in on what records are available and where they're available. And
yeah, I was gonna say, it just sounds like just knowing the tribe is a big step in doing research.
Absolutely, Mitch. Absolutely. A watershed step. Absolutely.
So Susan Arnold has asked a question about oral histories. Can you give some tips on maybe finding oral histories or where to look for them?
Great question. And I'm afraid, Susan, I have a pretty mediocre response. So where do you look for them? Yes. So a lot of oral histories are written. So someone will be talking to someone or writing their recollections of something, and they're never really published. So the minority of them actually get published, if it's a small run publication, but look for them nonetheless. And where do you find these? It's a rhetorical question. Where do you find these oral histories? So if a particular settler out on the frontier, experienced 15 to 17 to 20 years interacting with native peoples because his family was out on the frontier, where are you going to find his letters? Maybe in the local historical society, less likely, but maybe in the local public library, maybe in the state historical society, maybe at the Newberry Library in Chicago that has an amazing Native American collection. So knowing how information tends to be archived helps you kind of create a plan for where you're going to look. I usually try to go local, then sort of concentric circles out, state and national, and then special. So local would be local historical society, local public library. Oral histories, there are a number of oral histories that were made in the mid to late 20th century that are actually recordings that are now digital recordings of people remembering a couple of generations back. Where are those particular oral histories? State historical societies, local historical societies. Regrettably, to my knowledge, I wish that I were wrong, and I welcome being proven wrong. There's no national Native peoples, First Nations oral history project. Some tribes have oral history projects, and that's why going to the tribal website can be very important. But some of us have been spoiled by a national project like the Veterans History Project. Wouldn't it be awesome to have a national project like First Nations Oral History Project, where people go into their attics and their historical societies and their local libraries, et cetera, and find these things? Even religious repositories, if they were active in the area. The Franciscans, the St. John the Baptist Franciscans, if you're looking for Pueblo, I would certainly tap their archive. They may have little, but before the Southwest broke off and became their own Franciscan province as part of the Catholic Church, they were part of the St. John the Baptist Franciscan province, whose headquarters are in Cincinnati. So you have two places because you've done the deep dive and you know that, Franciscans very active amongst Pueblos, fairly recently, within the last 2 generations, they formed their own Franciscan province, but for generations before that, it was a different province. But it's kind of being really methodological about your search strategies.
Okay, I think actually you kind of answered the next question from Tracy, who was basically asking for a way to identify the local centers with significant resources. It sounds like what you said, you work concentrically, you work from the smallest area up to the largest.
Correct. Correct.
Okay. Leslie Johnson has a question asking, do Native American First Nations people participate in DNA research for genealogical purposes?
Yes, they do. Great question. Yes, they do. I am not an expert, so I'm going to be very careful about what I say, but we all know that we know the big names and the experts in the field. Blaine Bettinger, the legal genealogist, Judy Russell. I'm blanking on her name now, first name Debbie, but she's published through the National Genealogical Society. But specific to your question, yes, there's been a lot of writing and continued research. So there's data out there about how to go about evaluating DNA results to determine whether you might have some native blood somewhere in your past. Early on, I think it's gotten better, but again, I will encourage you to check this out for yourself. But early on, and I mean 7 years ago-ish, give or take a few years, a lot of people did have a small amount of Chinese or Asian, I should say, not Chinese, but Asian markers in their DNA results. And they were thinking, where is this coming from? Well, again, they've gotten better and better at honing those results, but many DNA experts, and I'm not, we're fortunate here at the Allen County Public Library. One of my colleagues, Sarah Allen, she's been doing DNA before people knew how to spell DNA. I mean, she was doing DNA before people even knew it was a thing. So she's very good at it. But back to your question, in the early analysis, which they've gotten much better, much more precise, the theory was that Asian markers were showing up in some of the DNA because they were related to First Nations. Anthropologists tell us, how did this continent get populated with First Nations people? Millennia ago, across the Bering Strait, people migrated from Asia across the land that's now the Bering Strait, down through Canada, down to the United States, Mexico, Mesoamerica, South America. That's anthropologists' hypothesis about how this got populated. We have archaeological evidence that thousands upon thousands of years ago, there was a Mississippian empire, and it's called that by anthropologists. First Nations people who were trading, had money, all of this discovered through anthropology. And I apologize to our friend that my answer is a little long and tortured, but DNA is getting so much better. And when you marry DNA with records, with great historical context, you can begin to find a good picture of your ancestors. So apologies for that rambling answer, but there's so much out there. DNA research is getting better and better all the time. Pursue it. It's worthwhile.
I agree. Susan Arnold has a question that I can actually answer. She's asking, is this presentation going to be archived on YouTube? Yes, it is. Curt has given us his gracious permission to post this, record it, and post it to YouTube. So be looking for that. We're shooting for 2 weeks, but due to the holiday season coming up, it may take a little bit longer, but just keep your eye peeled on the HPL YouTube channel for that. Let me get down. We've actually got a couple of follow-ups here to what we talked about earlier. Curt, Mary Hoyer says that the WPA had a project for oral histories, and that the Newberry Library has the Ayer collection of oral histories, which is, she says, is huge.
Yes, yeah. Newberry's a great library to check out, and a really solid website.
Let me see. I'm flying off the cuff now here. Sorry, Sue.
Okay. That's all right.
Natalie says, since it looks like my ancestor listed her birth date at 1804, and born in Georgia. It looks like she may be Creek. There are no counties listed on that western line, but listed as Native American lands. I guess 1804 Georgia. Should I concentrate in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or was Georgia part of a territory before it became Georgia? Could there be territorial papers?
Those are all really excellent questions. And I don't have definitive answers to provide you, but I'm so encouraged that you're asking those good questions, because what you want to do with those questions is you want to engage in a research process where you can find the answers. I don't believe, Georgia was, broad brush, Georgia was a penal colony back in the colonial times. So Georgia has been around since pre-country. So 1804 may seem early, but Georgia was around as a colony, because that's where a couple of countries sent their convicts to the great state of Georgia. So I would look for any kind of, State Historical Society. Georgia has one of the most consequential digital archives in the country. Spend an evening with a nice iced tea or whatever your favorite beverage is, and just look through, search through the silos of the Georgia Digital Archive. Look at their State Historical Society. What kinds of records does the State Archive, the State Library, and the State Historical Society have for the state of Georgia? You might be pleasantly surprised. Territorial papers, look for them. Every state has some kind of collection of territorial papers. And sometimes, because I'm going to get on a small little soapbox quickly here, because our history, our K through 12 history education has been and continues to be rather mediocre, we forget how early there are collections of papers. Now, they tend to be more general and not as specific as we genealogists like, but they're Indiana, just to use that as a poor example, Indiana has papers from before the Revolutionary War. And you think, wait a minute, Indiana wasn't a colony. Indiana wasn't a state until 1816. What do you mean they have papers? Yeah, there are trappers and traders and all kinds of territorial papers that have been published. Georgia, oh my goodness, of course there's going to be territorial papers somewhere. The challenge for us as researchers is finding where those papers are at. The research trifecta in not every state, but almost every state is State Library, State Historical Society, State Archives. And if you can leverage or get access to data in all three of those, your First Nations Native American research will be greatly enhanced.
Okay, actually, Mary Hoyer came in and followed up on Natalie's question and reminded us that some Georgia records are actually in South Carolina's collection from colonial times. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then Leslie Johnson follows up and says that there is a Legacy Family Tree webinar about Georgia that is currently free until November 17th. So there's a link to that in the chat. And then
That's a great tip.
Yeah.
And then Chris M says that did the Bureau of Indian Affairs deal with early tribes like the Pequot of Connecticut?
Another really great question, and I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but you'll be able to quickly ascertain that from their website, from the Bureau of Indian Affairs website.
Okay, it's getting kind of late. The sun's starting to go down here, so we'll pass back over to Sue. Thank you, Curt.
Thanks, Mitch. And Curt, thank you for the very selfless amount of time that you gave us today, and the time, the knowledge. And I think that if anybody wanted to ask further questions, our email reference is down on the bottom here of the slide. What is your email reference, email address, Curt, up there in Allen County?
Yeah, it's simply genealogy at, and then the library's 4 call letters, ACPL for Allen County Public Library .info. So it's genealogy at acpl.info.
Great. Genealogy at acpl.info.
Right.
Right. And either one of us would be happy to, or, our phone number, Google genealogycenter.org is the website, right?
Yes.
Genealogycenter.org is the website. So by all means, visit the website for the resources that Curt showed you, for the phone numbers if you want to talk to people, to search their online catalog to see what kind of books there are. And that's what we're here for. And Curt, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sue, and thank everyone for participating. This was great questions. It's really neat to see you all engaged. That's really, really excellent. Thanks a lot, Sue.
Thank you too, Curt. Happy Thanksgiving, Curt, to you and everyone.
Likewise.
Okay. All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Have a good, happy Thanksgiving to everyone too.